highly relevant. And the three perspectives are also very, very relevant at the moment, and of course, crucial perspectives. We do live at the moment in special times. We have seen rising unilateralism from the United States of America and the current administration. We also have seen a more confident, strategic, and geopolitical behavior from China. There's also talk about a decoupling between China and the United States. And in the middle of this, of course, is the European Union with current initiatives to answer this. And the big question, of course, is to what extent is this a real change of economic diplomacy as we know it? Or and also, how can the EU and other policymakers be successful in these surroundings? Without much further ado, I hand over to Stephen Woolcock, who will further introduce the topic area and also the book launch that we are performing today. My name is Philipp Lamprecht. I'm a director at ECIPE, and happy to hand over to you, Professor Woolcock. Thank you very much.
Philip, thanks very much. And I'd like to thank ECIPE and Clingendael for co-hosting this book launch. So the book is entitled The New Economic Diplomacy, and it defines economic diplomacy as decision-making and negotiation in international economic relations. The question we have today, though, is what can it tell us about the responses of the US, China, and EU to recent developments in the international economy? What I propose to do in this brief introduction is to say a bit about what economic diplomacy consists of, and then to compare the capabilities of the US, EU, and China in economic diplomacy, because I think this helps us to understand where they're coming from. So just to run through the order of the session, I'll give a brief introduction, and then I'll introduce three speakers who are also contributors to the book on the US, China, and the European Union. I'll introduce them at the end. We hope to do this all within about half an hour, so that there will be still a good 50 minutes, if not longer, for discussion. Philip will come in and as a discussant to kick off the question and answer session then. So, what do we mean by economic diplomacy? First of all, the title is actually useful. It's called The New Economic Diplomacy. Fortunately, there's always something new in economic diplomacy, which has enabled us to write and publish 5 editions of this book. For better or worse, things change, and so there's always material for this kind of contribution. So economic diplomacy, one way of approaching this complex area is to break it down a little bit. And I would suggest you can look at 3 broad areas of activity. There's what I call commercial diplomacy, which is efforts to promote exports, attract foreign investment. There is international economic cooperation, which is promoting a predictable, rules-based economic order. And then there's economic statecraft, which is defined in the book as using economic instruments to support a global strategy. A global strategy usually related to national security objectives or enhancing relative power in the global system. So the question is, what can the book tell us about what is happening at the moment? And one approach to this is to look at the capabilities of the players we're talking about today and see how that relates to their responses. Let's start with the United States. So in the first area of commercial diplomacy, I would argue the US doesn't really has relatively limited capability in commercial diplomacy because there's no established links between the state and international business. Some of the leverage in form of tariffs as an effort to reshore manufacturing and attract investment could be seen as a kind of transactional approach to commercial diplomacy, but it's still relatively inconsistent and not based on a longer term strategy as it is, for example, in China with the Belt and Road Initiative and other such initiatives. When it comes to promoting international economic cooperation, as Philip suggested, there's been this tilt towards unilateralism in the US, which I think there's always been an undercurrent of unilateralism in US policy, especially in trade. But in the past, the executive branch was able to counter these unilateralist pressures by arguing that things can be done internationally through international cooperation. Now, the position we're in at the moment is that the US executive is no longer willing or able to make the case for international cooperation, mainly because there's a perception, right or wrong, in the US that it's not able to shape outcomes through the kind of multilateral economic cooperation that it pursued in the past. On economic statecraft, geopolitics, and in particular the US-China relationship, has strengthened the executive branch of the US. It's given it more policy-making autonomy because the executive branch has more power in terms of defining national security, foreign policy objectives. And of course, this autonomy has been exploited to the full and maybe beyond constitutional limits by the current incumbent of the White House. But US economic statecraft lacks in continuity. So you have changes between administrations, as well as some fluctuation within some administrations. So there's a lack of consistency. Turning to China, as I say, compared to the US or EU, China, I would argue, has considerable capability in commercial diplomacy, and it's deployed this effectively over past decades. And it has this because of this close link between the state and business in projecting Chinese interests in the international markets. China, on the other hand, hasn't had strong capabilities in shaping the international economic order. It's often seen the established forms of international economic cooperation as being dominated by the US, or more accurately, would be a Western influence of these institutions. But there is a rhetoric, a Chinese rhetoric favoring a predictable rules-based order, but this to date hasn't really been backed up by any clear positive strategy about how China intends to do this. When it comes to economic statecraft, China has, again, considerable capability. State-led capitalism means it can promote industrial strategies. It's got a large domestic market. So it has the capability of promoting key strategic industries and technologies. The shift to geopolitics has also arguably gone hand in hand with a centralization of decision-making within China. So the question here is this move towards centralization and away from more consensus decision-making in China. What implications does that have for the longer-term stability and consistency of Chinese economic diplomacy? Finally, I'm sorry to go so quickly, but I've given myself only 8 minutes. The European Union. So the European Union has no competence, legal competence in commercial diplomacy. This is something the member states do. The efforts to promote a stronger EU presence through commercial diplomacy is reflected in initiatives such as the Global Gateway, which I think we'll probably come back to talk about later on, and other similar initiatives. This is really a reflection of the relatively limited capability of the EU in this field. The EU's greatest strength, however, is in international economic cooperation, in rulemaking, if you like, and it has this by virtue of its internal market. The famous Brussels effect is also important here. But equally important, arguably, is the internal dynamism in European integration and the strength of the European economy, cohesion. So that's all important in terms of maintaining EU capabilities in promoting international economic cooperation. In economic statecraft, again, the lack of formal competence for foreign policy makes it difficult for the EU when geopolitics comes to dominate. And it tends to accentuate the limitations of EU decision-making, taking strategic decisions. But there have nevertheless been recent moves to enhance EU capabilities, such as in reducing dependence on energy, open strategic autonomy, cooperation in key technologies, etc., which all fall under the broad heading of economic statecraft. So summing up then, so the US lurch towards unilateralism reflects a perception that of relative decline in its ability to shape outcomes through international economic cooperation, increased presidential policy-making autonomy, partly a factor of the increase in geopolitics, means that worldviews of domestic politicians has then a disproportionate effect on policy making. So the established patterns of policy making, which economic interest groups and the like feed in and provide some stability, are no longer so effective. China has favored autonomous initiatives, such as in commercial policy, and the use of economic statecraft, given geopolitical trends. But when it comes to international economic cooperation, as I say, is there a strategy behind the current Chinese rhetoric? The EU faces challenges in geopolitics, but it's seeking to redress these and enhance these. However, the EU's interests, as well as those interests of the rest of the world, and most business interests, remain in providing a stable, predictable, rules-based system. So I think the EU should therefore probably play to its strengths and continue to find means of promoting international economic cooperation. I say that sitting in Brussels, but we can discuss it in the session. So let me stop there. I will like to introduce the next three speakers. I'll introduce them all now. So first of all is Alex Bobrovsky, who has been a US campaign operative and trade advisor. I'd also say he's a long-time student and practitioner of economic diplomacy, so he brings in a practitioner point of view as well. Professor Xiaotong Zhang is director of the China and Central Asia Studies Center, KIMEP University in Kazakhstan. He's also the editor of a journal entitled Economic Diplomacy. And finally, but not least, Mike Okano-Hymans, who's Senior Research Fellow at the Clingendael Institute where she leads the geopolitics and technology and digitalization program. So I hope I've kept reasonably within my 8 minutes. And I hand over to Alexander to talk in more detail about the US position.
Thanks, Steve. And before I begin, I just want to reiterate that these views are my own and don't represent any particular organization. So to start off, in very simplified terms, as Steve alluded to, we can think of economic diplomacy as a two-level game. On the domestic level, there's a negotiation between different actors to define a state's policy preferences and pursue them across trade, sanctions, environmental cooperation, etc. And then there's also the international level, the negotiations between states to reach an outcome. For the US perspective, under the Constitution's Commerce Clause, Congress theoretically should act as the principal with the power over regulating commerce with foreign nations, while the executive acts as a negotiating agent on behalf of the Congress. But if we look at the second Trump administration, that doesn't seem to match up. The current administration favors unilateral executive action over congressional executive agreements. So for instance, executive orders over treaty ratification processes and legislation. The administration is also eager to move very quickly and aggressively in negotiating trade and investment frameworks, and is willing to go outside institutional norms and use different policy tools to achieve its objectives. What we see is a relatively marginalized role of the Congress and a powerful executive that arguably is acting as its own principle in its own right. But President Trump, as a political figure alone, doesn't explain why this environment now exists for US policymaking. Indeed, we have to look at other factors as well that have contributed to this centralization of decision-making in the executive. The first factor that I want to look at is looking at trends over the last century. Congress has willingly delegated powers of regulating international commerce to the executive branch. On one hand, this can help enable a president to move very swiftly to try to strike trade deals, such as lowering ratification thresholds from a 2/3 vote in the Senate to majority, and promoting liberalizations and export-oriented policies in the post-World War II international order. For example, from 1985 to USMCA in 2020, all but one of the US's 16 free trade agreements were passed under the Trade Promotion Authority, which acted as a fast track for negotiations. But on the other hand, Congress has also delegated unilateralist policies that can be used for protection, such as trade defense instruments developed in the 1960s and 70s that I'll come back to. And while Congress has clawed back some powers occasionally from the executive, this typically has been modest at best. The second factor to look at is the recent geopolitical trends, such as US-China competition, which has elevated US national security and foreign policy interests, and thus executive autonomy. The US approach to international economic decision-making, as we just heard, is inherently linked to geostrategy and foreign policy. And while the US Constitution's Commerce Clause grants Congress that power to regulate foreign commerce, this often clashes with the president's authority over foreign policy. And those are arguments that are going to play out today in the Supreme Court hearing on the ECIPE reciprocal tariffs. Presidents of both parties have sought to maximize their autonomy over foreign policy and have often pursued executive-only agreements. If you look at all US international agreements from World War II up until the early 2020s, only 7% were approved by the US Senate. Likewise, both the Trump and the Biden administrations in this recent era have elevated key agencies and roles around national security. So for instance, the Department of Commerce, which is responsible for key aspects of economic security like export controls and Section 232 tariffs under national security grounds, and also the National Security Council. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan was very instrumental in the Biden administration's trade policy with the EU and in other markets. Additionally, unilateral trade policy tools that were designed for defensive purposes, like Section 301, 232 ECIPE, they're now being deployed offensively by the Trump administration to achieve their objectives. The third factor is America's turn to populist politics in the last 2 decades, which has enhanced a direct connection between the president and voters. And this has further sidelined the role of the Congress and has reshaped how interest groups interact to shape US policy. The president can mobilize public opinion to override congressional opinion, and this has definitely been the case in how Trump has reshaped the Republican Party ideology, where we've moved from over 2 decades from free trade in this Mitt Romney, Paul Ryan era to protection, and likewise the Democratic Party has also shifted. The importance of formal institutions to engage interest groups has also declined in relevance compared to the free trade era of the 90s and early 2000s. So for instance, business groups and companies, labor unions, consumer groups that have sat on advisory committees for FTA negotiations or statutory standing trade advisory committees. This is not as salient anymore compared to leveraging ad hoc relationships and being able to shape the influence of public opinion to move their objectives forward. And in the last few decades, Congress has also lost expertise in matters of economic diplomacy. As the numbers of committees have risen, members of Congress have become more generalists rather than experts on certain policy issues. And the fourth and final factor, President Trump's inclination for transactional deal-making and a zero-sum approach to trade also favors centralization and decision-making in the White House. He has an incentive to push the boundaries of statutes and the executive's relationship with Congress in order to act swiftly and aggressively with trade partners and create a maximum uncertainty to use as leverage in negotiations. And Trump has a personal preference to be directly involved in negotiations and the final decisions of these trade arrangements, relying on a smaller group of counselors rather than a larger and formal interagency process that other administrations might have relied on more. So what does this trend towards centralization of decision-making in the White House and executive mean for the future of economic diplomacy for the US? First, I think it's very unlikely that the Congress will reassert its authority over these issues, at least in the short term, because of the Republican Party's deference to the president on policy matters, and gridlock in Congress makes bipartisan legislation unlikely. And despite rhetoric and discourse that we've heard under both Trump and Biden about Congress wanting to peel back control, it's very low on the political agenda compared to other issues. Second, even once a new president is in office after the Trump administration, US security concerns are going to remain. And so the executive autonomy over national security is going to bleed over into economic diplomacy. Third, many interest groups right now are in a reaction phase to this relatively volatile policy period, where relationships and speed are more important than structural institutions to shape policy. Can they change this dynamic and enhance policy predictability, or is this going to be a new norm moving forward even beyond Trump? And finally, how will foreign countries navigate long-term economic relations with the US amidst rising uncertainty, including this preference for executive agreements that can be overturned by future administrations? And that question is probably best answered by some of my colleagues, so I'll hand it over from here.
Alexander, thanks very much. Very clear and kept to time as well. Excellent. I'll move on straight away to Xiaotong Zhang to speak on China's response to recent developments. Xiaotong.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Just want to show everybody this book. So a kind of marketing campaign. So good afternoon.
Xiaotong was the only one who thought to bring a copy of the book to the event, so well done.
Yeah. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be part of this discussion on the new economic diplomacy. I'd like to share some reflections on how China's economic diplomacy has evolved, shaped by both its domestic transformation and by the reconfiguration of a global power, and what does this mean for the European Union. Both President Xi Jinping and former German Chancellor Scholz have used strikingly similar terms to describe our era. President Xi Jinping speaks of 百年未有之大变局 in Chinese, which means a great transformation unseen in a whole century. And former Chancellor Scholz calls it Zeitenwende, which means a historic turning point. So they both capture the same truth: the erosion of US unipolarity, the geopolitical shock of the Russia-Ukrainian war, and the fragmentation of the global economy. For better or worse, both China and the EU have gone through a geoeconomic turn. So both China and EU have gone through this geoeconomic turn. What do I mean? Economics and strategy are no longer separate. Wealth, power, and geography now interact more closely than at any time since the Cold War. As I like to put it, the map has returned to the market. About China's economy, China's economic diplomacy actually begins at home. So if we want to understand better China's economic diplomacy, we need to understand China's economic diplomacy begins at home. Since 2014, the economy has entered what the Chinese called the new normal. Basically, it means slower growth, an aging population, and a need to move from quantity to quality, from expansion to upgrading. And the Communist Party of China's long-term legitimacy largely depends on maintaining stability amid this economic slowdown. China's growth model, which is investment-driven and export-oriented, has created tremendous industrial capacity at home. Managing this overcapacity is not just an economic issue, but also a diplomatic one. It pushes China to seek new markets, to seek new energy routes and development corridors, often in regions where European industries also operate. So many of the tensions between China and the EU are not simply about fair competition, but about how two economic systems manage different stages of growth and different models of surplus. In short, China's economic diplomacy is not only about ambition abroad, it's about resilience at home. In my chapter for the new edition of the New Economic Diplomacy, I define China's economic diplomacy as a two-way conversion between wealth and power. So fits very well what Stephen just mentioned and described as economic statecraft. So my understanding of economic diplomacy, especially in China's case, is about turning economic strength into political influence, and the other way around, political stability into economic outcomes. So this dual conversion lies at the heart of China's approach to navigating both domestic and international uncertainties. But such conversion doesn't happen in a vacuum. It unfolds within a changing global structure, a world in which power itself is being redistributed. If the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was the first great geopolitical shock of the post-war era, then the end of the American unipolar moment is the second. For 3 decades, the United States enjoyed an unprecedented position of dominance, militarily, financially, and technologically. But that unipolar order is now fading. We are witnessing the rise of regional powers like China, India, the Gulf states, and a realignment accelerated by the war in Ukraine. This is not just a redistribution of power, it's a restructuring of the world system. No single country can now define the rules alone. We can say if 1991 ended by bipolarity, then today ends unipolarity, and in between lies the unfinished business of globalization. Europe, too, is rethinking its place in the transformed landscape. The European Commission now calls herself a geopolitical commission. When this phrase first reached Beijing, there was actually genuine surprise. Some Chinese observers even imagined the European Union was turning to the old theories of geopolitics, like sea power theory, land power, Rimland, and great power game. But over time, it became clear that the EU's strength is not traditional geopolitics. It is, in my understanding, it is geoeconomics. And that gives the EU vitality. Because the geo in geoeconomics doesn't mean conquest, it means context. How to manage and convert wealth and power within a spatially conditioned structure of interdependence. Geography, in this sense, is not a constraint, but an enabling environment. It defines the corridors, markets, and regions through which interdependence can be governed. So when I describe the EU as a geoeconomic project, I mean it is a project that seeks to lead through connection, not domination. Meanwhile, as the EU has turned more and more geopolitical, calling herself a geopolitical commission, China has turned geoeconomic. And geographically, China has pivoted over time away from Europe. China's focus has shifted toward Southeast Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, the so-called Global South. And some of the regions, some of the major countries in these regions have now been given all-weather strategic partnership with China. And they are part of a community of shared future for mankind. So politically, Europe's position in China's diplomatic intimacy index has unfortunately declined. Economically, ASEAN has overtaken the EU as China's largest trading partner. So this is not confrontation, it is rebalancing. It reflects a shift toward a more diversified, multi-directional diplomacy. Just a few days ago, President Donald Trump revived the term G2, describing his recent meeting with President Xi Jinping as a G2 summit. Beijing, however, has so far remained cautious and ambiguous, neither endorsing nor formally rejecting the idea. I recall when I worked in Brussels, I recall that when G2 was first proposed in 2009, the then Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao firmly rejected, arguing that global affairs should not be run by two powers alone. That logic still holds true. In a multipolar world, a US-China duopoly may be a useful metaphor, but it is a poor blueprint. It is also a vision that neither China nor Europe finds particularly appealing. In my book, another of my book, New Economic Statecraft, I suggest that the EU, the US, and China have developed three distinct but competing ways of linking economics and power. The EU's model builds autonomy through resilience. The US model defends dominance through control, and China's model seeks influence through development. These models interact and sometimes collide. They are shaping the new world order, not through war, but through competing visions of how wealth and power should be organized. To conclude, both China and the EU are navigating an era where economic diplomacy is no longer about trade alone. It's about managing the conversion between development and security, interdependence and resilience, wealth and power. The paradox is that even as the political distance between Beijing and Brussels has widened, economic interdependence remains deep in trade, investment, and technology. If both sides can recognize that they are undergoing the same transformation, one geopolitical, the other geoeconomic, there remains space of pragmatic cooperation amid strategic competition. The challenge for our time is not to rebuild trust, but to reinvent coexistence, to transform interdependence from a source of vulnerability into a source of resilience. Thank you.
Xiaotong, thanks very much. So you brought in the China-EU dimension, which is fitting because we'll now move on to Micah to speak on how the EU is responding to these challenges in economic diplomacy. Micah, over to you.
Thank you so much, Steve. Thank you for getting us together for this occasion, but also for getting us together in that book. I think also then on paper we had inspiring discussions, if you will, but I'm very glad to now be able to contribute to this in a live setting. And of course, happy to co-host together with ECIPE. So on the EU, indeed, Xiaotong, I not intendedly, but to raise my hand. But of course, I was very tempted to respond while you were speaking, but I'll do so, of course, now. Although actually, I would like to start out by just saying a few things about what I wrote also in the chapter. And that was basically a reflection on the past, decade or slightly more than a decade of European or EU economic diplomacy. And here already things become difficult, right? Alexander mentioned two-level game. In Europe, we have a three-level game, right? Because it's also the member states and the EU and then international EU outside. So that's even more complicated. I won't go into that sort of academic unpacking right now, but I think it's important to highlight because Stephen already mentioned the competence, of course. Where's the competence to act? The EU has the competence to act on behalf of the member states in trade, but where we now see economic diplomacy moving, or actually where it first started with trade and investment promotion, that some people like us like to call commercial diplomacy, that's really also for the member states. And I was just looking up the dates when I first wrote something about EU economic diplomacy. That was actually 10 years ago in 2016. A short piece about who is afraid of European economic diplomacy. And in all honesty, our simple answer was very few people are, because there was no such thing as European economic diplomacy. Back then, in the years running up to 2016, the EU realized that in a world where we see more countries pushing their companies, sort of helping their companies to be successful abroad, and especially in certain sectors where private interests are at stake, such as in ports or building airports, but also in some strategic sectors, there was an increasingly strong push of governments. And we are, of course, Europeans started to understand that this is resulting in an unlevel playing field for European companies if our governments just sit back and do nothing, while other governments are pushing their companies in new frontier markets. So back then, the EU also started to think, oh, should we do this at the EU level? But the competence for doing this trade and investment promotion was very much at the EU member state level. So I can speak for my own country, the Netherlands, which has diplomatically a very strong representation throughout the world. And I can tell you, they were not so happy with the European push, because here's the two-level game of the EU and the member states. There was also competition between the member states. So this was complicated for that reason, while of course smaller countries, including in the Baltics and Eastern Europe, less developed countries with less diplomatic presence throughout the world, they could benefit from EU trade and investment promotion, commercial diplomacy. But that never quite developed, I think, in the way that Antonio Tajani back then was pushing for from the European Parliament. So this is, I think, where it all started, though, the first discussion in Europe about a sort of a new economic diplomacy. What happened after then, I think, was very different, and this is very much closer to what Xiaotong was talking about. Ursula von der Leyen's geopolitical, not geoeconomic, geopolitical commission, which in fact I think on many fronts was very geoeconomic, and it was just not a very popular term. So makes sense that she would call this a geopolitical commission, but I think overall it became very clear that because of the push that what we saw China doing in many regions that you just mentioned, Xiaotong, but also because we started to realize that, hey, the United States is asking new things of us Europeans. And I'm from the Netherlands, so we have this one company that makes the most advanced semiconductor chip machines. we started to feel some pressure also in doing certain things that we had not imagined earlier, called export controls, and imposing those on that company for things that would go to China. And that was a new sort of phase for the European Union, because we had always done sort of export controls at the national level, but we started to see now that we have to think of this at a European level to actually deal with the pressures that came to Europe, to individual member states, but of course affecting all of European member states. And we have to, probably we would do better, do ourselves a favor if we respond in a more coordinated way, rather than being played off one against the other by any foreign power. So the EU, I think, it very much evolved from, well, this sort of attempt at doing commercial diplomacy to more economic security is actually what we call it in Europe these days. And I think, well, probably economic statecraft you could think of as somewhere in the middle. But the challenge, of course, being that, as Stefan already said, there's also no formal competence to act by the European Union on behalf of the member states in this field of economic security. So investment screening, export controls, but also the promote side of all of this, which links to China's Belt and Road initiatives, Europe's global gateway. That's also, well, the EU from Brussels, there's a strong push for, can we please do more of this? But ultimately, it's up to the member states to decide if they want to contribute to this. Because there's overall no European company. All companies in Europe feel either like a global company or like a Dutch or a French or perhaps a Swedish company. And there's very little in between. So what do you do if you want to promote these companies going to specific countries that we deem of strategic importance? So we see here there's sort of a problem for Europe in the past decade, at least as I see it, that the EU and the member states have been in a sort of a constant state of catch-up and reaction to what happens in the world, to what happens in China, in the United States, and responding to all of that. And there has been, I think, just in the past few years, a real attempt to build our own strategic vision, to act from our own interests and with our own priorities. But obviously, well, even though everybody would say, yeah, it's sensible for the EU, please do that, we also understand the counter pressures for that happening. So I think here is where the EU stands today. Where in the field of protect on economic security, the EU doesn't have the competence to act. So implementation is really very patchy in different member states, and it's also not always coordinated over time. We see that with investment screening, where one country has more broader and stricter mechanisms in place and others came later. We see this also in the field of promote, that where now the EU is also want to invest more in, for example, CHIPS Act, CHIPS 2, then who is going to pay for all of this? And much of the same goes for Global Gateway. Member states tend to look at the EU, companies tend to look at the EU, and then the EU looks back at all the member states. So we see quite a lot of challenge, although I think that finally the strategic sense of purpose is building. What I see as the next big challenge for the EU in getting to a higher sort of next level economic diplomacy or economic security policies, if you will, is to really find better ways of collaboration and coordination between the governments and companies. We have been very much, well, we came from a sort of a paradigm where this was, of course, not rather taboo, I would say, in Europe, that companies and states would act in tandem. This was, in the Netherlands at least, the East India Company times various centuries ago. We did much of that. Then we lost all of that. And now we need to get back to this. If anything, again, because others are doing this. So this is also what's perhaps bringing me to my mission with my new team here at Clingendael, is how do we find ways to better understand the private sector again and to entice them to do certain things that they, well, for profit-making purposes are not inclined to do today, This, for example, includes diversifying supply chains. Perhaps many of you have heard of the Nexperia case, where a simple Dutch chip maker with a Chinese ownership was actually now in the middle of this geoeconomic storm. And we see, of course, that supply chains are interrupted. So should companies themselves not have acted on this a little bit earlier, knowing that in the past few years, we have gone through this shift of economic diplomacy, moving from commercial diplomacy towards more statecraft or economic security-like thinking. So we need to get companies to do more of that. And by the way, next to the book, can I promote then a little bit a survey results that we will be publishing next week, actually on the Clingendael website, with some findings of how Dutch companies see what risks do they see in this field. Are they acting? And I think we'll be doing a similar surveys also at the European level to get a better understanding so that Europe can be better prepared in this new phase of international economic collaboration. And thank you again, Stephen, for guiding us through that over the decades. I'll stop here.
Micah, no, thanks very much. I think, well, all our thinking has been shaped by one another, but you were instrumental, I think, in the debate on European economic diplomacy. Okay, so we've got about 3/4 of an hour. Before I bring Philip in as a discussant, can I just ask you to think about what questions you want to pose? I don't want to structure the debate too much, but if you have general questions on economic diplomacy, maybe we could start with those and then go through the US, China, and EU. It probably won't work out that way, but we can make an attempt anyway at that. Philip, over to you to kick off the discussion. If participants, obviously, I hope you'll be coming in with questions. Could you just send a chat through, and then I will pick up your questions as they come in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. And yes, I've been chosen to give a bit of reflection and also key takeaways from the, in my opinion, excellent contributions from all three speakers. So I will be referencing also my own contribution to all three speakers. I would firstly like to start with a bit of an analysis and some thoughts on the US perspective. So what has been described very well and what we have seen also is, if not a change of economic diplomacy itself, then at least a change of style of conducting the tradecraft of trade policy negotiations. And I would like to offer some thoughts on the cost dimensions of this change in US policy. So whether you agree or don't agree with the type of economic diplomacy that is being done, there are some objective general planks for discussion regarding the costs of these choices that are made by the US government. The first is uncertainty, by which I mean uncertainty for businesses. So it was mentioned by Alexander also that uncertainty is a tool almost that is being used. But it is true that uncertainty is not good for company decisions. For example, investments are often delayed. Companies are more hesitant. They are more reluctant to invest. So there is a price tag when we think about the real actor on the ground behind trade policy, which is the companies making decisions, especially competitive companies engaged in international trade and investment. There is a price tag related to uncertainty. A second price tag from the US policy is trust. And I'm now going to introduce some concepts that I believe are very important in economic diplomacy. And one of them is actually trust. A lot of negotiations and outcomes boil down to this concept as well. And the cost of the US trade policy or new economic diplomacy by the US is also a loss of trust. I mean, look, for example, just to mention the Canada-US relationship. It has been mentioned by Canadian policymakers and also stakeholders that there's a before and after. That things are not going to go back to normal. And that is also another price tag. Another concept I would like to put forward, where also costs are related to this, is that of timing. It was mentioned, for example, by Alexander twice and I was listening to this very closely, that the new style of policy by the US allows to come to trade craft regimes or new trade deals, as it's being said, quickly. And also it allows for swift reaction. So that is at least the theory by the US administration. But in reality, there are some costs related to timing. So trade policy relies on a certain, first of all, level of certainty of deals made. So yes, it is possible to make agreements faster, potentially. It's also possible to react faster. But what we have seen is that the half time of these decisions has been reduced drastically. Some deals that were made had to be renegotiated 2 months or 3 months later, immediately. And so another cost level related to timing is that it appears that you need to constantly renegotiate some of the agreements that were done with the US. And this also, another part of the timing cost, has to do with sequencing, which is a basic element of economic diplomacy. What I mean by sequencing is that usually one trade agreement, at least when we talk about free trade agreements in the traditional style, one trade agreement usually comes after the other. What this means is that the entity that is currently negotiating, for example, with the European Union, is always very interested in knowing the last deal that the EU made with other countries, so to say, to be able to reference itself and to gain at least as much as the other before. So what it means, if constantly there's doubt about the half-life of deals with the US, and they're apparently constantly in need of being renegotiated or reconsidered, if there's less trust that agreements with the US are final, it also creates a cost in terms of certainty for other trade partners that are interested in getting something from the US in trade deals. So the US policy has some general costs associated to it that come from uncertainty and also that come from uncertainty, trust, and timing. That's the first point I wanted to mention. Then a second point, which is very important as well, and this was mentioned by Xiao Tong, as he said, the map has returned to the market. That's a crucial element, crucial observation. I could not agree more. And this shows a second development, which is that economic diplomacy has become more strategic. I mean, I'm now catching myself also at doing some promotion. We at ECIPE last month have launched the Geoeconomic Interconnectivity Index, which covers the level of interconnectedness between the neighborhood of the EU, 23 countries, and the EU itself, compared to Russia, China, and the US. And what we have observed in this multi-year project is that, as it was mentioned by one of the panelists during the launch event, the EU neighborhood has become a battleground for influence. And China, for example, is very, very active. And of course, a part of economic diplomacy is also not only trade, but also investment. And I think it's fair to say that countries such as China are using investment policy very strategically. And we see this, for example, in the EU neighborhood itself. So that's the second observation where I completely agree with Xiao Tong. Yes, economic diplomacy has become more strategic. Now, turning to the EU, and this is also the first general consideration, is of course a question how to be successful in this new environment, how to be successful with a more geopolitical China, a more confident China, more unilateral US, and a US that does have a trade policy that seems to create some costs for the community of countries. And the question, of course, for the EU and in general is how to be successful. While I'm not entirely convinced that trade policy and economic diplomacy has fully and permanently changed entirely, I do believe that the conditioning factors of bargaining power, of getting what you want in economic diplomacy have shifted. So some parts of bargaining power in economic diplomacy, and I've done a PhD thesis on this, I don't want to drag anybody back to it, but some parts are clearly economic power, obviously market size, and other parts of it are also to be a leader or successful in coalitions, in coalition building, for example, in multilateral fora, for example, World Trade Organization in Geneva, and then there are also ideational factors. So what is called constructivism in IR theory. So what we see certainly is that in this new type of economic diplomacy, and I agree, economic statecraft has become more important. And I believe that therefore also some of the economic market conditioning factors, so pure market power, have become more important in bargaining power. So that's one observation that can be made. And what this means for the EU is that the EU is facing uncertain times, geoeconomic times, and also times in which economic diplomacy is becoming more and more strategic, and where also conditioning factors based on market power are a larger part and more prominent part of the mix of how to be successful. And what this means for the EU could be that, as was also mentioned by Michael, the EU should focus on its competitiveness and on realizing its economic market power. It should exactly, and I couldn't agree more, focus more on the dialogue between business and EU policymakers. It should enable business more. And a strong response to this uncertain world is a highly competitive EU. And so relying solely on the Brussels effect and playing a waiting game, I don't think that is enough. I think the EU needs to be proactive, and it needs to focus on its strengths, and it needs to mobilize competitiveness in order to react to this new economic diplomacy. A very final point is that, of course, we are covering here academically the topic of foreign policy analysis, specifically economic diplomacy as a sub-region in it. And so also processes matter. So just a final point for EU policymakers is also the generation of knowledge. So the generating knowledge. I, for example, have observed and also been involved in a lot of impact assessments for DG Trade, also via the London School of Economics, where I worked for a long time, and as a researcher. And so I have observed that the EU is, of course, generating a lot of knowledge on its economic diplomacy. But just to note one example, in impact assessments that are being conducted, for example, the impact on the EU neighborhood is not specifically analyzed. So we have impact assessments for least developed countries, for other specific types of countries. But for example, the EU does not generate enough knowledge in its own impact assessments or trade sustainability impact assessments, specifically on EU neighboring countries. So it just shows that there is also this factor of creating knowledge and laying priorities of knowledge creation and economic diplomacy. And I think also here the EU can do more. And without much further ado, I hand over to our chair and moderator, Steve, to start off the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Philip. I would like to, some of the questions link in directly, I think, to a number of points that you made and previous contributors have made. So rather than read out the questions, I'd like to actually bring in the people who posted them in the chat. The first question comes from Jazz Becker. Can you put your question very briefly, Jazz, and say just where you come from? You have to unmute. Oh, okay, sorry, I've been told I should read out the question. So Jazz asks, how does US economic diplomacy balance competition and cooperation with China while strengthening their alliances and economic resilience? Alexander, I guess a question to you, first of all, but some of the rest of us may want to come in.
Sure. So to start, I would say, at least right now in this, what I'd say the Trump-Biden era, so the definitively post-Obama era, the US is much more focused on competition rather than cooperation with China. And right now, I mean, we've certainly seen that with extraordinarily high tariff rates and tit-for-tat export controls. But at the same time, in terms of the US, at least this administration, how it views competition with China, a bit similar to China in terms of looking in. So this administration is of the belief that putting up a tariff wall helps onshore manufacturing. there's a belief in the US market is, I mean, it is huge. And so that's why businesses and countries have to deal with this policy uncertainty from the US. You know, as Philip was saying, losing trust with partners and allies, on the one hand, is certainly true, but Canada is forced to deal with the US. It's the biggest trading partner. You know, no matter what happens, if it might like to one day be in the EU, but it's going to have to deal with the US in USMCA negotiations, bilateral trade agreements. And so that's just a fact. And that's what a lot of countries are now facing. I don't think the policy making processes that are coming out of the Trump administration could be replicated by a smaller, medium country and be taken seriously. There has to be already that economic base to force this. But the Biden administration was also looking at economic resilience, but that was more in terms of industrial policy, the Inflation Reduction Act, giving out you know, subsidies, tax credits as incentives to try to build in the US. The Trump administration is more focused on protectionism, putting up these trade barriers, export controls and restrictions to try to slow the pace of innovation in China. But I mean, in the long term, that's going to be very hard. And you do still see the Trump administration occasionally still engaging multilaterally or through the G7. So for instance, the G7 was the forum that came up with basically the détente agreement around the OECD BEPS tax framework, even though that wasn't, they didn't have the actual mandate for the G7 to be deciding this, but that's where the decisions were taken. And similarly, we've seen in recent weeks, the US looking to the G7 in terms of cooperation on critical minerals and in a recognition of, even though they want these self-sufficiency of critical industries and inputs, they cannot do this overnight. They can't even do this in a few years. So the US is still forced to cooperate to some degree.
Alexander, thanks very much. So on alliances, though, it looks as though, I mean, some of the writing about US economic statecraft suggests that it's moving away from alliances. So it seems to be, I mean, with Europe, it's not really building alliance with Europe in terms of, in order to strengthen the competitive position or its position vis-a-vis China. It doesn't seem to be working very closely with allies. It's gone more towards resilience, as you were saying. Is there anything more that can be said on why the current administration seems to be neglecting the US traditional ally?
I mean, if we also step back even longer in the grand scheme of the US, the post-World War II period is a unique period that America was very liberal and very much at the forefront of multilateralism. The long arc of US history has been to be more protectionist and unilateral in foreign policy decisions and trade policy. But I do think there still is some forms of cooperation and the leveraging of alliances. So you still have, you know, AUKUS, for instance, the Biden administration. I mean, going back to Micah's points about the Netherlands and export controls and semiconductors as a critical industry, you had the Biden administration applying pressure on Europe to be pushing for stronger export controls and investment screening, doing it in a different way than the Trump administration would. But there was still that type of cooperation and pressure with, you know, traditional allies like NATO allies or allies or partners in the Pacific. But it is a bit more complicated in the Pacific, where a lot of countries, they are trying to balance the US and China. They want to be trading with both. They don't want to be in a you know, specific sphere of a geopolitical influence. But you know, these in the short term, at least, the reality is that countries are basically being forced to make trade deals and concessions with the US, irregardless of their, you know, long-term policy preferences. But certainly these actions from the Trump administration are going to be shaping these governments' long-term thinking of how they engage with the US.
Alexander, thanks very much. Moving on to some questions on Europe. A question here from Michelle Egan. Hello, Michelle. You put in a couple of questions. Can I just pick one, which is the Brussels effect a useful concept, given the walk back on recent initiatives, and beyond data privacy, how expansive can it be in global regulatory terms? Micah, would you like to have a go at saying how relevant the Brussels effect is? I know Philip mentioned the Brussels effect also in what he said.
Sure, yeah, so happy to go first. Philip wants to add. The Brussels effect is an interesting one because it's not sort of recognized as economic diplomacy, because it's very much a domestic thing. And it's not like a trade agreement where you negotiate with an external partner. But this is, of course, where Brussels agrees to something, new regulation with EU member states, and then others are inspired by that and copy parts of that, usually not the full 100%, of course. They tailor it to their own sort of situation. But is that a useful concept then in economic diplomacy terms? Well, that's something I guess that requires a bit more thinking, but maybe that was not the question. Is it useful with regard to recent initiatives? That's perhaps, I'm not sure what exactly that is referring to. But the Brussels effect, I think, can still be interesting. We now have an AI Act, for example, and AI is a very new domain where I think many of us are worried about developments, where many of us also want to reap the opportunities of development. So for the EU to collaborate with other countries to find a proper balance and to just get to regulation for the risk-based, for where there's risks with AI. I think this is a misunderstanding with the AI Act sometimes, that it tries to regulate all AI. Well, obviously not. It has a risk-based approach to AI. And I think even if I speak to representatives of American Anthropic, they're actually very happy, and they say the EU should be doing more of that. So if that's the link to economic diplomacy, that's an EU, initiative for regulation of a certain domain within the EU is an inspiration for talks with others. And then hopefully at a multilateral level, beyond, of course, different bilaterals. I think that's still in many ways very much alive, although it's perhaps not as full-blown as we initially hoped it would be on certain fronts. Philip, I'll leave it to that. Over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, from my side.
Anything you want to...
From my side, just wanted to say that we did extensive research on what exactly the EU is doing domestically and what are the effects of domestic EU regulations on the EU neighborhood, together with Bertelsmann Stiftung over the last 3 years. And we found that there are a lot of extraterritorial negative effects of EU regulations. And the main mitigating measure for this would be for the EU to spend a lot of resources and also efforts to make it easier for other countries, including the neighborhood, to become compliant. So certain docking mechanisms should be included in regulations. There's also the question of compliance, regulatory conformity. And so this should be made easier for countries. And then I think the Brussels effect would be also much more powerful.
Philip, while I've got you on the line, so to speak, there's another question here from Mike Newt regarding the EU's neighbourhood policy, especially with respect to countries currently in the accession process. Is the EU sufficiently aware of the sacrifices these states have to make in order to align to EU security policies. For these countries, commercial considerations in their economic relations may outweigh strategic ones. Can I just say that in a sense, of course, EU neighbourhood policy is a form of economic statecraft in the sense that it's using economic relations to promote greater European security, and it's always been part of the aim of those policies. But Philip, you may have something more specific as you were talking about neighbourhood policies.
Thank you. Well, I think it's a very good question, and one could say it's, of course, depending on country by country basis, but one could say that probably there is still room to do more when it comes to this awareness. Also, I'm saying this because many of these countries have been in a state of waiting for years, if not longer, if not decades and longer. And this, of course, shows that this is a very slow process. And what the EU should be very aware of is the domestic realities on the ground in these countries, the real needs of companies, stakeholders, and also government, both ministries and governments that the people in these countries have. And I believe more resources can be spent on really, in an eye-to-eye level format, on really spending time and effort to understand these countries better. That's the first point. And the second point is that in the new economic diplomacy, where strategy plays a bigger role, the EU has to be aware, and it is, of course, that there is competition. It is no longer the case that countries are waiting endlessly to become part of the European Union. There's active competition by other players, other powers, including China, to push narratives, to gain influence, to also politically push narratives forward. So the EU is in a heavy competition for some of these countries, and again, timing plays a role. You could say a little bit that some of these countries have made themselves comfortable on sitting on the fence. And if you have been sitting on the fence for a decade or longer, you start to play a game where you try to see where you can get something from one side and then get a profit or benefit from another side. And so this long delay that the EU has caused in its accession policy also will create additional costs. I think the EU needs to dedicate a lot of resources and also a lot of knowledge and understanding in order to get some of these countries down from the fence where they have been put for 10 years or longer.
Okay, thanks very much. Xiaotong, I'm going to switch. There's some questions coming in inevitably for you. If I could, first of all, raise the first question, which there was a question about US alliance policies and strategies. Could you perhaps say anything about China's alliance strategies in terms of shaping international economic outcomes? But I've got some other questions here for you after you've tackled that one, and they relate mostly to Chinese EU cooperation, which you talked about. First question here from Marty Serra. Do you see any solutions soon to Chinese overcapacity? How should the EU respond if it can? And then another general question in the context of increased geopolitical tensions with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, what is the scope for EU-China economic cooperation in general? I guess that's just a question of maybe you fleshing out some of the points you were making earlier.
Yeah. So first, whether China has any alliance strategy. In China diplomacy, they do not call it alliance. China's foreign policy explicitly rejects entering into a military alliance, maybe with very few exceptions. So basically China, to be more more precise, China is now establishing a hierarchy of a diplomatic intimacy. So it's not alliance, it's a diplomatic intimacy. But there is a hierarchy which consists of 4 levels. So the lowest level is a partnership. The second level is a comprehensive strategic partnership between China and the EU, between China and Spain, for example. The third level is all-weather comprehensive strategic partnership. Sometimes between China and Kazakhstan, they call it permanent CSP. And the highest level is something they call community. So it's called a community of shared future for mankind. So so for example, Serbia has got that diplomatic labeling. So it's actually China's diplomatic signal. So when Chinese companies see this labeling, so they feel more relaxed making investment there. And Serbia got the level of all-weather CSP. So not as high as Serbia. So Central Asia, the whole region got a community of shared future for mankind. So you can see from this the hierarchy of diplomatic intimacy structure, then you can see China is actually building a regional order, or also shaping neighborhood policy and global diffusion of norms and standards, etc. So this is the first question about China's alliance strategy. The second about the overcapacity. So in the near term, I don't think that China can solve this overcapacity. So actually, after 2008, when China stopped the Keynesian stimulus, I think in 2012, 2013, China started to tackle overcapacity through something called the supply side structural reform. So Keynesian tackles the demand side, and later, after 2013, China started to tackle supply side. That is to reduce overcapacity. But unfortunately, due to the worsening global geopolitical situation, it's very difficult to shut down more factories to reduce capacity in such a simple way. Because CPC legitimacy comes from jobs creation, comes from economic growth. So China has to use both hands, Keynesian stimulus and also supply side structural reform. So the final question, I think about EU, China, Russia. I think China needs to understand that the EU is really in a war situation, and China needs to put itself in the shoes of the EU. Because it's very difficult to really put a China-EU relationship one step further. Because we have already seen that China-EU relationship actually is only at the middle level, comprehensive strategic partnership, and even de-risking. So I think both China and the EU need to do something to work together. For example, in the third country, for example, in Central Asia, working together, or in Southeast Asia, or in Latin America, in the Caribbean region, to create some synergy and to help each other. That being said, if China's position vis-a-vis Russia remains the same, I don't think that the EU can really improve relationship with China. And it's very difficult for China to change its policy vis-a-vis Russia. So this is a geopolitical reality. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much, Tong. So I think there was also a question about what can the EU do about it. So there are instruments that can be used within international trade law, so within WTO trade law, in terms of anti-subsidy safeguard measures, for example. But I think the onus is on those being consistent with the general norms and of the WTO. Right. Next question. I've got a question, Micah, a question for you from Marisari also. Yes, it was another question. The question is, what should be the next steps for the EU on economic security? Is there still treaty space to tackle these issues? That seems to be a question of whether there has to be new treaty powers for the EU to be able to respond to some of these geopolitical points.
Thanks. Yes, happy to take that one. In all honesty, I think if we were to aim for treaty change, many of the issues that we should be tackling today will probably be too late to actually do that. So while treaty change in the long run could be also an objective, I don't think that should be where we are, should be hopeful that we will find our solutions to the issues that we need to face today and tomorrow. So yes, it could be here a parallel track for both, but I think in all honesty, having spoken to different member states, I see very little willingness of EU member states to hand over sort of mandate for many of these issues that we have been discussing, including export controls, to the EU at this point, because obviously this is national security concerns based on which individual member states take action in this front. And national security, I haven't seen EU member states very willing to give up mandate to act for. So getting to the first part of the question then, what should be next steps for the EU? Because obviously there should be next steps. And I think here it's time to also acknowledge that the EU has taken great steps in the past few years, especially on what we call the promote side of the protect side of economic security, where I think changes have come for European standards, sometimes amazingly fast speed, but obviously still more needs to be done. The anti-coercion instrument has been adopted. We also need a willingness to really apply it, of course. So that's perhaps one thing where we can discuss further and decide, are we ready for that next step to actually implement the tools that we have been developing? But in all honesty, I think that on the protect side, the EU has done a lot, and we are now, sufficient barriers have been raised, that we're not just letting the market do its work all by itself. So what we need to do now as next steps, I think, is to invest far more in what the EU economic security strategy says is the promote side. And that is promote in terms of helping, assisting our companies to be more competitive. That is not a call for sort of a new industrial policy where we throw subsidies, but I think we can do far smarter industrial policies with incentives, offering companies incentives to do certain things. Can be tax incentives, can be other incentives, but that would probably be wiser compared to subsidies. Also, we need to rethink perhaps some regulation that is now handled at the member state level, like labor regulation. If we want to have the fastest, the companies that can scale fast, then they also need labor laws that allow them to do so, to hire fast if they need to, and to let go if they don't need such staff anymore. Obviously, European labor laws don't really allow for that at this stage. So just throwing something perhaps quite controversial in the group here for Europeans to chew on, should we perhaps have different labor laws for this new and emerging field of technology and digitalization, where, frankly speaking, it's usually a younger workforce that earns higher salaries on average. They may not need the sort of the societal safety nets that we have built and that we want to maintain in other fields. But in order for Europe to be more competitive, we probably need some looser labor laws. So that's just one example. Also on the promote side, and I'll end with that, conscious of time, that global gateway, I think we really need to make sure that this becomes more of a success, where we help our companies to build market share and to spread European standards and norms to other countries. Quite a lot still has to be done, but we're also on the right track, I think. It's a glass half full if I'm concerned. And we have on the Clingendael website a few thoughts on digital global gateway, specifically how to do that better, with EU member states stepping in sectoral sort of solutions that can build on the more foundational infrastructures that at the EU level we have been trying to push forward. So just a few ideas for next steps.
Thanks very much, Micah. So one more question I'd like to get in. I don't know if we'll have time for final remarks or comments, but you might want to think about that if anyone wants to say something at the end of the contributors. So the question from Edith Tsao is about supply chains. So we're seeing a reshoring, reducing dependence on reducing dependence, open security, autonomy, etc. What does this all mean for the security of supply chains? I think this is a general question. Who would like to kick off on that? Let me start then.
Okay, you start.
Xiaotong, yeah, go ahead.
I think first of all, supply chain issue is really a geoeconomic issue, that with a very clear geo in it. I think that from my perspective, based in Central Asia, I see tomorrow is US Central Asia C5+1, and also between EU and Central Asia, there are also similar C5 plus EU mechanism, which are very much focused on critical minerals, rare earth, and resilient supply chain. And I always strongly believe when it comes to supply chain, it must be global, at least regional. So that creates room for China, US, and also the EU and other players to work together. Because if it is fragmented, it's no more global supply chain. And I really hope that countries, regions can work together for the resilience of global supply chain. Back to you, Steve.
Anyone else want to come in? My assessment view on the supply chains is that there has been some retrenchment. There's the general desire to reduce dependence on limited sources of supply, but that doesn't negate the existence of supply chains in general, and indeed it feeds into discussions such as what impact can Europe have? One thing it's trying to do is to use supply chains in order to, if you like, beef up the Brussels effect, in the sense that it's expecting supply chains to comply with certain European standards. But there is certainly adds some insecurity in some cases, but the general impression I have is that there's some reshoring, but it's only of a limited nature at the moment. But we shall have to see how that progresses in the future. We're just about on just about 3 o'clock, and the nominal time for finishing was, I think, about 3 o'clock. We still have a good number of people online. Thank you very much for joining us this lunchtime and for asking questions and for staying online and right until the end. Do any of the contributors want to say anything else before I make a plug for the book? No, okay.
Well, perhaps Steve, let me just, yes, the book, of course, for further questions, do have a look at the book. And from my side, I think I'd like to reiterate for all the talk about geoeconomics and supply chains that are also reconsidered and being diversified, moving away from efficient sort of settings. Let's not forget what you just said. For the EU, also upholding rules-based multilateral system is truly important. If there's no few other flag bearers for that, especially. So I think this is where the EU also needs to step in to the void and find the right partners to work with to do that.
Yes, exactly. Thanks very much for that. And of course, should cooperate with key strategic players, but there are lots of other players out there apart from the US and China and have very similar interests to the EU. So now my plug for the book. Xiaotong, can you hold the book up again? There's the book. The link to it is in the material you've got. Thanks very much again to the contributors for participating. Thanks to ECIPE and Clingendael for hosting the session. Thanks to Guifrey here in ECIPE for facilitating the webinar. That's it. Look forward to seeing you in the near future, either online or ideally in person.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.